Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Ed Barnard. Based in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, Ed's first career was operating system development amongst the Wizards of Cray Research. His second 20-year career has been web software development for countless clients, companies, and projects. You can learn more about Ed on his LinkedIn profile, which is really easy to find. Ed is the author of his latest Leanpub book, Beyond Prompt Engineering, The Revolutionary Way to Learn Augmented Thinking. In the book, Ed, and I'm quoting him back at himself here, reveals a set of revolutionary thinking patterns that transformed computing during the Cold War and now hold the key to unlocking unprecedented value from large language models. These patterns exist whether you perceive them or not, like black ice on a winter highway, but once recognized, they transform how you think and collaborate. In this interview, we're going to talk about Ed's background and career, his professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his latest experience using Leanpub. So thank you very much, Ed, for being a return guest to the Leanpub podcast.
Thank you.
You
got it all correct.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. I always invite guests to give me the opportunity to correct my mistakes, and I guess quoting you back makes it easier to be correct. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story, but everybody who wants to hear that can go back to our first interview that we did way back in 2022, where we talked about that. So I was wondering if we could start by just hearing about what you've been up to in the last couple of years.
I have a new origin story.
Okay.
That is a picture of crew. I am here in front of a World War II B-25 bomber that flies.
Oh, wow.
So as part of the commemorative Air Force, it's actually the world's largest private Air Force. We don't have armament. Well, yeah, we have the B-25 bomber I showed you carries 8 50 caliber machine guns.
Oh, wow.
And all the air traffic controllers are so polite to us. And I keep laughing about that. But it's because it's a bridge to the past. We are showing what it was like in a tangible fashion. And I mentioned that because one, that history and background is fitting its way into my books, because if I'm talking about things that were a while ago, they are very often in terms of World War II or the Cold War, and also, but also, I made a mistake with the current Beyond Prompt Engineering book, and I now realize that. And the nice thing about Leanpub is I can correct the mistake. I can correct the mistake with a rewrite or enhancement or more to it. And everyone that already bought it automatically gets the updated version, which is very convenient for me, but obviously for the readers also. And that is that I went for theory first instead of hands-on how to do things. And part of what I've been learning with actually flying in the airplanes and listening to them and so on, explaining all that is, it's all hands-on. It's very concrete. It's memorable. Reading a software patterns book is not as memorable as taking off down a runway with an over boosted supercharged engine that's driving propellers that you don't dare take your earmuffs off because you will have instant hearing loss. And so, in fact, one thing we explained in the cockpit, the pilots can reach 190 decibels. If you look online, you will not find charts that hit 190 decibels.
Yeah.
It's a shotgun blast, only it's the shotgun blast that's very close to you, and it's continuous from engine run up to wheels up. And that's the noise, and that's what they had to do. And so describing things like that are it's real. And so that's what my writing is becoming. And I had artificial intelligence helping me with that, not in writing the words, but helping figure out what my patterns were and better ways to structure and organize things to be learned, which is actually what the topic is. But so that's my new background, is working with the commemorative Air Force and World War II aircraft.
That's really interesting. Just to dwell on that for a moment. What's your role on the team?
Oh, we're all volunteers,
Okay.
and uh, my role so far has been my interest is historian, but I acted as tour guide,
Hmm.
and um, okay, where I actually started was and I'll make this quick, of course, but um, in March, sat in a bomber and thought about, okay, well, do I want to get a ride in the bomber and I realized getting a full year membership in the commemorative Air Force and full support and so on is just over half the cost for a year as one ride in the bomber. So I explained the math to wife Susan, who teaches school, and she said, "Well, yeah, that's good math." So I got addicted for a year, and that worked. But um, what they did 2 months later was said, "Okay, Ed, we're going to do our Living History Flight Day, our first one of the season in Minnesota. Of course, seasons are summer seasons, not winter seasons, and um, and so you will help be a tour guide on the ground with the families and so on as we give rides to various passengers as an experience." And I got so nervous about that I made myself a little pocket notebook with little tiny pictures in it so I could tell which of our 4 airplanes was which. But the bomber I could tell because it has 2 propellers. I could count to 2.
Right.
It was literally that bad. You know, I had a blue airplane, a green airplane, a yellow airplane, and one with 2 propellers. And it was that bad. So I did some research, and if you see books behind me, about 100 full-size books later, um, cover to cover. Um, a lot of research, but
Hmm.
so I got talking, explaining, and I noticed that the air crew was kind of standing back listening, and I thought, good, this is good feedback. Leanpub is all about feedback. Also, that's very very important. So I was thinking, my first time doing the tours, I would like advice, and the feedback I got back was, Ed, you need to write these stories down so the other tour guides know what to say. You might recall that on our first podcast, I did something really odd, which was I wrote something down and held it up on an index card. And it was the word debugging. Digging more deeply than anyone else does, that's a debugging skill. To me, it's the same skill. Um,
That's a very
and that actually
point I want people to note for later when you say that's the same skill, about patterns and stuff like that. So I just wanted, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to note that point.
Um, thank you, because I'm about to interrupt myself for the same reason. Um, what I finally realized with AI help, I've always assumed that other people think the same way I do. Well, now I've met enough people online that identify as neurodiverse that I know there are different patterns of thinking. But what we finally realized is when I was in writing about the Cold War, Cray Research is a Cold War company, and so I'm doing a history of Cray Research, and that's now under contract with A Press. So I retired it. There's a really nice retire button. You should know about that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it documents that's exactly what it's for. So the documentation is great, also.
Hmm.
Um, and what I realized was in building those revolutionary things, code breaking equipment, supercomputers, the whole bit. Um, it wasn't just building those things. We developed different ways of thinking in order to build those things, and essentially, it was coming up with order out of chaos. We got this, we got this, we got this, we got this, and we got this. And so the idea of it's what I call finding patterns in the noise, or finding order in chaos. Another way is connecting the dots from this event to this event to this event that nobody else sees that connection, even when I show it to them. But that's just what we did automatically. And I'm now realizing we had a different ways of thinking that we had developed. And it was all of us. It was so automatic that nobody thought to write it down.
Yeah.
I've gone back at oral histories and I kind of see the same. that sounds familiar. That sound, from NASA, from MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, um, from the NSA, and so on. And um, so what my AI companion and I did was we went through 500 pages of my book and we pulled out those patterns. This is a pattern that's not caught. This is a pattern that's not caught. This is a pattern that's not caught. And one of those patterns is digging more deeply than anyone else. And that becomes a base, and then that level of knowledge becomes a basis for debugging for me, among other things. The expression, well, I did my
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, really looking forward to getting into that and some of those patterns and what patterns mean in this context, which is very fascinating. But one thing I wanted to pull on there, what thread I wanted to pull on there was saying about we all have very different patterns of thought, and this is something that I've personally been thinking about a lot lately. And one of the reasons is a couple of years ago, my co-founder Peter, and he wrote a book about this, so don't worry about me telling about it. But he realized one day he had something called aphantasia.
Okay.
And have you heard of that? Um,
I've heard the name. That's it.
yeah. So I think the name was only invented in the 90s, but basically he can't independently form image, and unfortunately you have to frame it negatively, can't, but he can't form images in his mind independently of looking at things. So when he closed his eyes, there's no my wife's face, there's no my son's face, there's nothing. He can't recall images in his mind, and he can't form them.
I am very close to that.
Sorry?
I am very close to that.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah, so you might wanna check out his free book that he wrote about the experience of learning this stuff, and the fascinating thing about it is, so Peter and I have known each other since we were 14 years old, right? Guess who else didn't notice he couldn't do that? Me. Um, and and, uh, and now I personally, I think I have comparatively to even more ordinary people, an incredibly rich visual internal life. And what had happened was basically the way Peter thought about it was, you know, when he was in physics class and they said, imagine a ball rolling down a hill and then up the other side and then he didn't think people were actually picturing it, right? He thought they were doing something similar to that, functionally similar to that. So his pattern of going through life matched, in a sense, what most people were doing most of the time when they were talking about picturing things. But what he was doing was very different when he was asked to picture something. And but it matched, right? He could pass the physics classes. He could, like, all the visualization exercises he was being asked to do in these circumstances, like, picture a fork in the road, right? He could functionally picture a fork in the road. And he never noticed. And, like, there's something also kind of quite dramatic about realizing how we can all interact with each other in our day-to-day lives and have no idea how radically different what's going on between our ears is, because our ways of interacting and talking about things, like, the gears kinda fit together, but they might be turning at different completely angles, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yes. Um, my AI assistant, which I've been using Anthropic's Claude, by the way, um, keeps saying, well, you should do a visualization of this and visual. And I kept saying, I can't. But what I can do is I can do a text description of it and have an AI render it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And Claude said, okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, yeah, I am very, and so communicating via text, typing has worked out very, very well. And I know that visualization is a difficulty for me.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and
Also why I do back-end web pages, not UI design.
yeah, yeah, but it is amazing too in this example. I mean, like, you're finding a new way of using computers to do other things, but applying what you're talking about is applying the sort of same patterns that you used in different ways in the past to using AI. And one of the great things about the book, I mean, the book is very kind of like meta at the beginning, right? Because you're talking about in the book about the problems you had writing the book and how you used AI to help solve it by discovering that it's the patterns that were really what's at stake for this book in the series, or this introduction to what the series is going to be. And just to give again, I promised a few minutes ago we talk about patterns, and so there's just two things I want to quote from your book about that. Uh, the first one is, you say, "The first breakthrough in explaining this concept came when I realized that I taught myself to think like a computer thinks. I think of the flow of instructions through the processor rather than focusing on the result." Um, and so that's an example of thinking like a computer. I would imagine is an example of a kind of pattern. But there's another very, and this is I remember from our last podcast, there were examples like this too. But you say, um, in the section on cross domain connection making, you say, I'm just going to quote the whole thing. This pattern represents perhaps the most revolutionary cognitive skill in this list. Unlike specialized technical knowledge, the ability to recognize structural similarities across seemingly unrelated domains, like actress Hedy Lamarr connecting player pianos to torpedo guidance, thereby inventing Wi-Fi, creates genuinely new possibilities rather than just optimizing existing approaches. Um, so I really love both of those passages. In particular, one of the things your books are great at is saying, like, torpedo guidance and an actress, kind of invented Wi-Fi, and seeing the introduction to that last part that I just wrote was the pattern of black ice formation, and how on roads, which being from Saskatchewan, I'm familiar with, but basically to anyone not familiar with it, in cold places, you can get ice on the road that you can't see. Uh, if you're accustomed to it, that road ahead might have ice I can't see on it, and you drive a certain way as a result. And that's a pattern that can be applied in lots of different areas, not just, but the crucial point I think you're making is that this isn't just a metaphor. Like, this is,
Right.
or a comparison. Like, it's the same pattern when you, for example, go into a book promising you a result that you can't see yet. Sometimes that's actually out there.
Um, I realized, well, yes, I can talk about and present these patterns of thinking and get a blank stare. It just doesn't, and that's why I got thinking about black ice. And by the way, the Pine Bend refinery, it is so annoying to the rest of us that know that's going to be happening. You probably are familiar with that idea too. There's likely to be ice around that corner.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
uh, and
I know.
so you're aware of it, and you may or may not. And so, but then I realized, well, just telling somebody that it something might exist isn't good enough.
Mhm.
Um, and that's why the book that you're quoting from, I now have a rewrite intended over the course of the summer. Oh, by the way, I have a co-author also. I need to tell you about that, which is
Yes, yeah,
um,
for sure.
um, in fact, let me just break off. Um, having in the first book, I have a picture of my son Jacob in my lap. He is about 4 months old at the time, with his first Apple II computer. And of course, he couldn't type. I did the typing for him. I took really good care of it for the next couple of years. But um, so he is now a professor of computer science, Dr. Jacob Barnard, in North Dakota, which also does get cold air from Saskatchewan, by the way. Usually hits Minnesota, but if it goes straight south, he gets more Alberta air. Um, uh, and gets to fight the fires at 20 below. He's volunteer firefighter, and
Oh,
uh, so he knows. Anyway, but he is as a liberal arts college teaching computer science. He is very interested in connecting the computer science requirement to liberal arts degree, which one piece of that is realizing that people don't no longer really know how to think. And in fact, um, conversations at the end of the year, they were realizing that it's not they have a problem with AI, it's that people get Chat GPT to do the thinking for them, and they skip the thinking part. And that's not doing anyone any favors. Um, so, um, So the idea of thinking skills, well, it so happens that ACM, Association of Computing Machinery, the biggest computer science organization, and IEEE, that they set the curricula and so on, they actually have a formal committee making recommendations for connecting computer science to liberal arts tracks. And that would be the people that I want to connect with, because they're very, very interested in teaching computer science people how to think. I'm making a distinction between thinking skills and implementation skills. How to code this, here are some patterns and whatnot. Those are all how to do things. But what about the thinking skill of making the connections in the first place? And so on. That's the area that just isn't being taught. Well, Jacob is on that committee. He's been publishing papers. So he is my co-author for aligning that with, and the other thing is, my Cold War way of thinking is not necessarily relevant to a Gen Z person who wasn't even born in the previous century.
Yeah, you mentioned the Cold War, so actually that's something I had in my notes to talk about. So why don't we go down that sort of
Please,
or a
please.
little bit? And when you say Cold War way of thinking, what was the Cold War? And assuming it's already over, it's still over. And what do you mean by a Cold War way of thinking in your experience?
Here is the classic picture. The Cold War is when United States believed that everything was cool. We're the only people with an atomic bomb, and we had blown up two of them, and we weren't telling anybody that we didn't have a third. We just got away with two of them. And at the same time that the CIA was saying it's going to be at least 5 more years, with 3 to 5 years before Russia has an atomic bomb, a weather airplane, essentially it's a weather balloon, but it was doing flights from Japan back across the Pacific over to Alaska, detected atomic radiation that came from an atomic bomb. That was the Russian atomic bomb. And it was, I think, a week or two after that was detected that the CIA officially published saying, yeah, it's going to be 3 to 5 years out. Obviously, yeah. And that's when President Truman came forward in, I believe it was September, announcing that we have detected an atomic bomb was set off within the Soviet Union. And that was the Cold War. Up to that point, well, may I describe a couple more pieces?
Sure,
They
yeah.
all come together, which is there, of course, were atomic bombs ending World War II, which in Japan. So the ingredients for what happened are, one, an atomic bomb, but number two, a delivery system. In other words, a Boeing B-29 Super Fortress capable of delivering an atomic bomb. Well, we knew that because Russia was an ally, we knew that 4 B-29s did land in Russia. And so that's a concern.
Mhm.
And around the same time for 1949, there was an air show, and sure enough, 4 B-29s flew over, and then a fifth one flew over.
Oh.
It was a B-29. It had been reverse engineered. It was a Tupolev, Russian built. It had been reverse engineered rivet by rivet, and they had an operational B-29 bomber, which we know is capable of delivering an atomic bomb. So all of a sudden, the US had a problem. And the problem isn't what you think. Do you remember it's 1983, the old movie War Games,
Yes.
where global thermonuclear war? Thinking in those terms, the problem was a B-29. If you ship couple dozen B-29s straight over Alberta and Saskatchewan, right over the North Pole, right over and then could they slip under the U.S. radar? Absolutely. We had no radar defense system that was good enough or made sense. As a result, we did things, but that concern was the Cold War concern. And it was answered with very, very large computers. And it didn't matter how meticulous the assembly language code was or anything else. We were working on winning the Cold War.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. I didn't know that about the bombers. That's fascinating, and like to tell it so dramatically about the reverse engineered one flying over very pointedly to everyone watching. Look at what we can do now. But of course, the other big technological moment was Sputnik, when the Russians launched
Yeah.
satellite into space, and all of a sudden Americans were like, "Oh, they're up there, and we're not." And this sparked a huge program of investment in research and development in the United States. I forget what it was, but it was some huge proportion of GDP just for the space program and just for the space program and things like that. But it was a time when people were thinking very hard, not just, I mean, I'm going to be crude yet. Yeah, there you go. Not just about like, not just about like hitting the deadlines or the numbers for the next quarter. They were like, we have to be getting this right when we're trying to get into space. We have to be getting this right when we're going to build thousands of weapons that, if they got out of hand, could destroy us all. Like, we have to get them developed fast enough that we can be a, mutually assured destruction kind of thing, which is what the point of war games, the climax of the movie War Games, to give it all away, and although everybody knows, is the computer that's taken control of all this stuff realizes, oh, it would be more damaging to win this war than it would be to wage none at all. So I'm not going to do it, if I recall the movie correctly. And so, but I think what's people think about Cold War, they think of war, they might think of fighting. Oh, cold, but there was no fighting. But it was a technology battle in a lot of ways, is one way of thinking about it. And there were the America wouldn't, I mean, insofar as it did up until now, America wouldn't have won that war if it hadn't been for getting things right. And that's when I hear you talk about the Cold War mindsets, that's kind of what it put me in nostalgically for a generation before mine or two. It put me in mind of that they had to think hard, not just about their problems, but about the way they were thinking about those problems.
Do you let me grab one more.
Sure.
This is why I have such a horrible cluttered backdrop. I have real things. That is a circuit board from a Cray 1 supercomputer.
Cool.
And that was installed in Saudi Arabia. But the Cray 1, the movie War Games wanted to use the Cray 1 as their computer.
Really?
Whopper. Yes. Cray said no. Because at the time, 60% of our customers were the secret government labs that you were just describing.
Oh my.
So we didn't want to make our customer base really mad with us.
Right.
The USA and the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Los Alamos, Livermore Labs,
Yeah.
Sandia, and the other places that we still don't know about. And so Cray Research said, no, we don't want that piece of reputation. But yes, that was never officially known, but that was kind of like the word we got in the hallways, that yes, they wanted the Whopper to be a Cray 1.
And to give people sort of an opportunity to sort of, we've got you here. So one thing I'd like to ask you about is the revolutionizing kind of cognitive patterns that you talk about in the book in its current format. And I know it's, the rewrites coming, but what are the revolutionizer cognitive patterns that you're talking about? What does that mean?
Oh, yes. I actually want to start with what I call I jokingly call it the time travel pattern. For example, back in 1977, long time ago, Thomas J. Ryan wrote a science fiction book called The Adolescence of P1. And P1 was this computer program, process number one on IBM mainframes, took over mainframes, took over the whole world, et cetera, et cetera. But, it was science fiction. If you took that book and put it on a library shelf, unread for 45 years, which I did, I got it back from the library, interlibrary loan, and took it and read it, it describes how training an LLM works. It describes, in many ways, how a large language model, a generative AI model, works and how to interact with it. And it describes it correctly throughout the book. All you needed to do was just let it wait 45 years and then open the book, and you had correct information. So I proposed that fact to Claude, and Claude said yes, and went into gorgeous detail as to this and this and this. The book describes how to win at tic-tac-toe using matchboxes. It was based on a paper. I looked it up. It was actually published in 1961. It was one of the very first things on artificial intelligence and how to learn things. Basically, if it's a winning move, you put a green match in, and if it's a losing move, you take a red match out, and so on. And so over the course of many games,
Yeah.
you have a record that you have learned from. And that was the theory. And I said, well, I bet that's a whole lot like how we do the vector dot products in the training of in the transformer phase. And Claude took about 500 words to say hell yes.
Yeah, that's
and that's actually how I figured out these methods. Is I'm applying things that I knew from the Cold War that have been completely not relevant and are suddenly relevant again because large language models have very close constraints. The context window, the training knowledge cutoff date, and guardrails that are built in, and so on. But dealing with very small memories, entire supercomputers fit into 128K bytes. That's including channel buffers, and the fastest thing on the planet. But so the obsolete has become relevant again in terms of ideas. All that to say that in 1952, there was something called the Armed Forces Security Agency. It's the precursors to this. It became the National Security Agency. All the military stuff became Consolidated Armed Forces Security Agency. That then turned into the NSA that we still know and love. They wrote a letter to William F. Friedman, their head cryptographer, and said, we think of computing equipment, they weren't even computers at that point, in two ways. There's labor savers and there's revolutionizers. Something like, a computer can speed up what task you're already doing. It can do it an awful lot faster. Google does that. And so some machines are labor savers, and they are often key punch and card based. They were used during World War II, tabulating equipment, and so on. Adding machines fall in that category. The other is, and what they do is, and so with those you ask, okay, which of these jobs could be done faster with that computer? It's going to, will it speed things up, or will you spend more time doing setup and takedown than you will with the speed up? Then they have what they call the revolutionizers, and they require a completely different kind of thinking. The question is not which jobs can be done faster. The question is, okay, what can we get this thing to do that's never been done before? And that's what the Cray Research computers did. Is they were the basis for in the early 1960s, also IBM systems were the basis of the NSA being able to do things that nobody else could.
That
And that's still the case.
that reminds me of that connection between like what are you doing? What can you do with this thing? As a is it reminds me of something else you talk about and like you've got wizard hat icons throughout your book, but you move on from when you introduce the concept of this revolutionizers to the concept of that you call wizard thinking, where you talk about I really like this idea. I'll just quote you again. When you understand the importance of what you are doing, details such as actually designing the software or producing the code will take care of themselves because you will see that they do. These outcomes are part of that.
That's what I learned in the Cold War. That is it. It how grinding or grueling or um, pencil and paper and hours of desk checking, it didn't matter because we were winning the Cold War. That's why we were doing it. And oh, by the way, some of us knew that that's a whole lot better than elbow crawling through a trench.
Yes.
As so, but yes, that's the way I see it. And when I first typed that out, it just sounds so arrogant. Well, I'm just so awesome that the details are going to take care of themselves. But it's not that. It's um I think it more if you take iron filings on a piece of paper and put a magnet underneath it, and the iron filings line up in the lines of magnetism.
Right.
It's that kind of thing is things will align because you will see to it that they do, because they are part of that importance.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that idea a great deal. One example, like, that it brings up for me from my vicarious experience is a friend of mine's a neurosurgeon, and sometimes he has to do very long surgeries, and I'm making a bit of this up, but, like, basically, like, when you go into, like, I don't know, like, a 19-hour surgery, the person is gonna die if you fail, and with the importance is their life, that's the only reason you're there, is to save their life and to give them a healthy life going forward, and the way you get through the 10 hours of just step by step by step by step until you get to the really important part, and then the 9 hours afterwards where you're winding down what you've done is because you have an understanding of the whole time you're doing it, you have an understanding of the importance of the whole that you're in, like the WHO that HOLE that you're in,
Yeah. Yeah.
so you
Yeah.
will find a way to structure your time in your mind in advance and remember what your steps are. You will offload that task. Say if you're like, oh, I'm building up too many steps in my mind right now that I won't remember them all. You'll say to your assistant, note this down. After we do this, we're going to do that, that, and that, and that, and that. So you'll figure, and then when you get to that point, you'll be like, okay, what was the next step that I outlined 5 hours ago when I knew I'd get here? And I'm just very much, I also identify with that idea that like knowing where you are and why you're there, not in a romantic sense, but in like a very practical sense, leads you to the outcomes that you need to get to.
You just identified one of the 10 patterns. And that is you were describing a system as a whole, in this case, the procedure, and the processes that were flowing in that system. Um, one of the key constraints, of course, was that you just dealt with was the fact that you're going to forget 5 hours from now.
Mhm.
So you dealt with constraint not as a barrier, but you did something about it,
Yes.
which I call transforming the constraint.
Mhm.
Um, um, oh, I'm just going to keep playing games with you here. Dune by Frank Herbert.
Oh, yeah.
Many people have heard of the book Dune or the movies or whatnot. Um, there, Paul Atreides was quoting the first law of Mentat. In fact, I might have put that in the book. And you can't understand a system by stopping it. You need to, your understanding needs to flow with the system, and that's exactly what you just described with the neurosurgeon. It's
Yeah, it's a very striking. I hadn't heard that before, but you can't understand a system by stopping it is new to me. That's a very interesting.
Right. I can quote one to you. I put light on it. Um, how did that sit with her? I think she got mad. She said the mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. So I quoted the first law of Mentat at her. A process cannot be understood by stopping it. Understanding must move with the flow of the process, must join it and flow with it. That seemed to satisfy her.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
There, a lot of those same principles are buried there in Frank Herbert's book, oddly enough. You got to know it first to see it, but um, another thing was all the weird non-English words that were made up words. Once I lived in Saudi Arabia and was learning some Arabic, I recognized them as Arabic words that were in fact referring to the thing that it was talking about. Um, uh, the Fede, his death warriors, his Death Eaters were the Fedekin. Well, sure. Ibn Saud, the original king of Saudi Arabia, had some Death Eaters that were radical, and they were the Fedekin. This is a real group of people that Herbert used. But anyway, we seem to have digressed.
Yeah,
But
no, that's fine. No, that's very interesting. But I mean, that's another example. One can go too far with this, but it's another example of like a pattern. Um, uh,
yes,
something from the actual fact in history making its way into but a certain kind of behavior on the part of, say, a mercenary or something like that can pass through time and pass through various media into our own experience. In the interest of time, uh, unfortunately, I do have a hard stop in about 10 minutes or so, and
yes.
I want to do a couple of other things with you before we go. So, um, in the last part of the interview, as you may remember or may not from 3 years ago, I like to ask the guest about their experience writing. I mean, you talk about your experience writing the book in the book, but just maybe there are people who skip to this part of the podcast. By the way, they're just interested in writers writing. So, what was your experience like? What do you think your experience is going to be like as you rewrite the book over the summer?
Um, it's going to have two big differences. One, I have a more coherent plan because I now understand the system of what it is that I'm trying to write about. I have an understanding that I just didn't recognize before. The other part is I have a co-author who has direct classroom experience. I was a software instructor, and I was actually a very good one at Cray Research. During the Cold War, I was talking to people that had the same thought patterns. It finally occurred to me what the difference is. But now I've got my Jacob. In Crocodile Dundee, what's a donk? I've got a donk. Hi, that's donk.
Mhm,
I've got a Jacob.
mhm.
But so those advantages to writing are very good. And I've got a writing plan, and actually based on the Nathaniel Bojich story, who invented celestial navigation, well, made it accessible. And he did two things. One, he did not put anything in the book that he couldn't directly teach the crew, even down to the cabin boy. He also explained things over and over and over and over. And when an explanation finally took, that's what he wrote down in the book.
Right.
And so that's the feedback loop. And so there's the critical area of feedback. And that's a piece I haven't had before. So um, writing down lots of words is easy because I've been trying to get this written down for about 8 years. Um, and I now just do markdown automatically. It's just plain, so the mechanics are easy enough. Um, and I will flip between handwritten on my remarkable tablet or typing or Scrivener or just straight inside GitHub, and because I'm to the point where I want to see previews from the Leanpub build.
And yeah.
And that's literally my process.
Yeah. That leads me to the last question that I always like to ask on the podcast if the guest is a Leanpub author is, in your current iteration as a Leanpub author, if there's one thing, there was one magical feature we could build for you, um, besides distinguishing between lists of figures for code versus images, which you posted about on the authors forum recently. If there was one magical feature besides that we could build for you. Not saying no to that, by the way, just I've already noted it, so I'd like to know something else. Or if there's something that has you shaking your fist going, damn you, Leanpub, why does this suck so bad still after all these years, that you could ask us to fix? Can you ask us what you would like us to do?
Let me first tell you the magical feature that you did build for me.
Okay.
And that's the lifetime membership where I can have up to 100 books. I've got literally 20 or more books stealthed that are projects that may or may not come to fruition. But it gives what that does is that gave me a tool chain I could use to build PDF files for any purpose that I wanted. Sharing a document or whatnot, and all of it on my based off my private GitHub repositories. The other piece of that was GitHub.
Right.
When they went to unlimited private repos, those two things put together, that's my secret weapon. So you've already done that. The one thing I am realizing that building for PDF, building for EPUB, and building for print, you can't do that off the identical code base. The layout's got to be a little bit different, or it's going to have differences. And I think what that means for me is actually going with 3 separate repositories, but I haven't gone to that stage yet. So potentially 3 different branches.
Yes.
I don't have a good solution, but then you got to switch back because you define, I know you've got a preview and a published branch. So I know you've thought of that type of thing, but I think the one thing for me would be the fact that I think those 3 things require slightly different input into the build chain.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So for anyone listening, what we're talking about here is actually kind of complicated. But when you click the button to create a Leanpub book, we create, if you're writing in plain text on Leanpub, in Markua, our Markdown syntax version, when you click the button to create an ebook, it creates a PDF version, it creates an EPUB version, it actually creates an HTML version for the web as well, so people can read online, and it actually creates 2 versions of that under certain circumstances. But separately from that, we also have the ability to produce a print-ready PDF. And that's the kind of thing so you've written on Leanpub, it's all digital. If you want to get into print, you've got to find a print-on-demand service like Amazon KDP or Lulu or Ingram Spark or something like that. And for them, you need, people are always like, I love my books in print. And it's like, they're all digital to begin. They're all born digital. That's the fact these days. And in order to get a book in print, you need to have a digital file, a digital PDF, but all those separate versions or types of product from that one manuscript, can be formatted differently for various different reasons and stuff like that. And we do have people who switch. So and then I won't go and explain Git and GitHub too much, but like basically what you can do is you can think of it as like a folder with your book manuscript in it, and then you can have a kind of like subfolder where it's like, this is the folder to use for the print ready PDF, and this is the one to use for the ebook. And so we do have authors who switch between those branches, so they can keep one main folder with branches underneath it and switch between the 2. But that's kind of clunky, because the ideal thing would be when you go to the print ready PDF page on Leanpub to have it pointing at the correct branch there without having to kind of hack it the way anyone sort of who's used Leanpub enough to know anything at all that I'm talking about would know what I mean. But thanks very much for that, Ed, for that suggestion. That's really good for us to know. That's a very power user thing, which is the kind of thing we love.
In fact, an idea which I also saw in the forum, so it's not original with me, is if we could do 3 different folders, manuscript 1, manuscript 2, manuscript 3, in the same branch, and point to alternate folders.
Yeah.
Then that way I don't have to switch branches to compare to, um, the chapter with the figure at the top of the page versus at
Right.
the.
Yeah. No,
Um,
that's very interesting. That's something.
that's why I'm thinking the separate repositories for me is
Yeah.
probably less painful.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, thanks very much for that, Ed, and thank you very much for taking the time to reappear on the
Thank you.
podcast. The book we're talking about today was Beyond Prompt Engineering: The Revolutionary Way to Learn Augmented Thinking. So, thank you very much, Ed, for being back on the Leanpub podcast.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. I sure appreciate it.